I'm very happy and extremely honored to start this series of lectures on borders organized by the European Network of the Institute of Advanced Studies. After this time of hard lockdown, it is indeed so important to take part in joint activities going beyond those tight borders that we have been experiencing in the last months. Precisely because of this need to cross borders, when I started thinking about a lecture on food, I was tempted to choose the title of Food Without Borders. It would have immediately reminded of humanitarian actions taken in various countries against famine and food shortage. It would have hinted to Heritage Network radio programs that point out how immigrants made many countries' food systems vibrant, diverse, and delicious. It would have suggested how food helps connect people and ease potential conflicts across cultures. Moreover, every food preparation is the result of combinations of ingredients and practices often coming from extremely diverse places. We all know at least fragments of the story of assimilation and hybridity, which started centuries ago. Rice came to Europe from the Indian Ocean in classic antiquity. Wheat arrived in the Americas as a part of the Columbian exchange. Tomato, a word deriving from Aztec, made its way slowly through Europe since the early 16th century. But it only really caught on at the end of the 17th century, when it was turned into a sauce, then a real must in cooking. It took centuries before it was integrated in the Italian cuisine. In Florence, it probably arrived thanks to the exchanges enhanced by Cosimo de' Medici's wife, Eleanor of Toledo. In other rural, secluded areas, tomato came much later. So late that my son's great-grandmother, who was born in the very last years of the 19th century in an alpine valley, thought that it was a fruit. It took long before she started to use tomatoes for cooking. As you know, encounters and exchanges are never uniform, and borders often follow a crooked line. We tend to associate tomato sauce with spaghetti and to consider this spaghetti with tomato sauce an ancient original Italian national dish. However, in Italy, tomato blended with pasta only in the mid-19th century. Goethe, when traveling to Italy, described pasta invariably as white, the condiment being butter and cheese. Through the history of spaghetti with tomato sauce, Massimo Montanari has deconstructed all too easy myths of origins. Gastronomic identities derive from ongoing shifts and encounters of various kinds. The cup of chocolate drunk in the Netherlands in the early modern age, and even more the English and in fact British cup of tea, are perfect symbols of globalizations, as well as of empires and colonialism. Cocoa originated in Mesoamerica, blended with molasses produced in the East Indies. Cane sugar from the British colonies of Jamaica sweetened the refreshing tea made with leaves from Assam. Spices traveled from south to north and from east to west. Recipes traveled both ways. Food is the result of the work of time, of transfers and exchanges, more than of static local traditions, erroneously perceived as long-lasting and directly bound to ethnic groups. Many dishes are the outcome of numerous and often countless transplanting and grafting. Clashes and boundaries, ethnic or territorial, originally marked by different culinary regimes, often amalgamated, producing hybrid and more refined eating cultures. In the Middle Ages, a shared European culinary tradition, diverse as it was, came into being through the integration of previous opposite cultures based on meat and based on cereals. Later, the Arab presence introduced many new tastes and plates. I felt the need to start this talk recalling the long and almost never-ending story of foods and recipes transpassing boundaries, the natural ones of seas and mountains, as well as the states ones. Let's remind that often even wars paradoxically facilitated new food experiences. You can see here Parmentier, a French army pharmacist who discovered potatoes as a prisoner in Prussia during the 7 Years' War. All this reminds how important it is to focus on the time and change rather than on supposed static myths of origins, often connected with borders. Now that we have recalled this underlying assumption, we can look at the other side of the coin. Our topic today is less ironic and in fact more disturbing and unsettling. Food as a tool to build, tighten and harden borders. We will focus on two moments and phenomena. The first part of the lecture focuses on nationalism, when food became a tool to design national borders. The second focuses on recent right-wing populism. They use food to consolidate borders between us, defined by our traditional and fixed identities, and the others, alien perceived as having static identities. It would have been interesting to add recent food wars to the picture, but there is not enough time for that. Before delving into the core of our lecture, however, it is useful to remind of the importance of two other kinds of much older borders connected with eating habits and prescriptions. First, the ones marked by religious affiliations, and secondly, the symbolic and political ones between the ones who have the power and their subjects. The Bible establishes Jewish dietary rules, and these rules exclude animals considered unclean, like the pig or the camel, along with animals living in water, which have not ears and scales. Within Islam, there was a ban on pork and also on wine. Thus, the pig, debarred from the Jewish and Muslim tables, paradoxically became the perfect marker of Christian gastronomic identity and metaphorical borders. From ancient ages well into the early modern times, food contributed to making visible other symbolic borders between those who detained the power and their subjects, or between the elites and the ordinary people. Until the French Revolution, food symbolized, first of all, power and social distinction. For the wealthy, it was largely eating to impress. Royal banquets represented the strength of the king, the male figure of the ruler, sometimes represented as a hunter or a meat-eater, and as a warrior or as a civilizer. Noblemen and the most opulent new bourgeoisie used their lavish banquets to make clear how powerful they were. At the beginning of the 12th century, an author aiming to celebrate the pomp of the wedding of a duke wrote that the precious spices used to season the food were so copious that they had to be minced not with a mortar, but ground with a mill. A 17th century Italian chef, Bartolomeo Stefani, explained that a lord should not be straitjacked by local limitations and seasonal produce. With a good purse and good steeds, he could get hold of anything at any time of the year. Along with clothes and jewels, representative architecture, and other symbols of power, commensality and social morphology design and mark borders increasingly important within different social classes and groups and depicted the order of the hierarchies. Expenses were so huge that in many states, as in the Republic of Venice, sumptuary laws explicitly forbid certain kinds of luxury in banquets. As Paul Lloyd pointed out for England between the 16th and 17th century, luxury foods contrasted sharply with the inexpensive and usually easily obtainable foods associated with their menial servants. Therefore, they were necessary because they enabled the rich to distinguish themselves from the others. A few scholars have argued that in some early modern centralized states, cuisine was already interpreted as national. In 1651, for instance, La Varenne explicitly titled his book Le vrai cuisinier François, the real French cook. Generalizations are always hard when they concern the long run and an ample space. In Europe, however, also in the history of gastronomy, by the way, a word invented in 19th century France, the real cleavage was set by the French Revolution. It was then that things drastically changed. Food started to identify the we of the invented national community against the others. This represented a sharp turn from its previous use to signify divisions within society. It was then that the idea of the middling cuisines started to gain ground. The gap between the food of the powerful and the food of everyone else within the state was replaced by the gap between the states where the shift to middling cuisines had occurred and the states that retained a sharp distinction between high and humble cuisines. By the end of the 19th century, however, national cuisines were established in North America, Europe, Latin America, and Japan, and were discussed in India and in various parts of the Ottoman Empire. Culinary writers realized that their texts and cuisines had to move away from the previously overtly class-based culinary orientation to the new abstraction of the imagined national community. Thus, the borders set by the discourse on food rapidly shifted. Again, generalizations are difficult, and processes were often uneven. It was then that a new national discourse with national taxonomies and referring to national borders took shape. Not even in France cuisine belonged to the masses. However, its linguistic system became national, in France as in Italy with Pellegrino Artusi. In the 19th century, the meaning of you are what you eat started to change. Dishes and cuisines helped draw or confirm old and new, existing or imagined geopolitical and mental borders. This process reached back to the already existing association of national characters with certain foods, as also with habits, dresses, and look. Cookbook writers, along with intellectuals, historians, and folklorists, use similar rhetorical strategies to convey strong feelings of inclusion within the nation. In Italy, Spain, and in India, culinary authors contributed to tightening the borders unifying the country's diverse regions. It was the via Gefühl well described by Norbert Elias. However, they started defining the cuisine of the others as alien. Between the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, the opposition between Englishness and Frenchness was increasingly synecdochized through food. The beef-eating John Bull, invented 100 years before, became extremely popular as the hero of British liberty and was largely used in cartoons with political significance. In the eyes of French travelers, English people became roast beefs. Food entered the new logic of cultural engineering of nation states and linked the idea of the Kulturnation to its daily domestic experience in what we historians call now banal nationalism. The United States of America began shaping its national identity through culinary discourse and unifying and civilizing practices of home cooking. After the Civil War, the 1876 centennial encouraged further debates on national cuisine. American authors tried from very early on to define the national cuisine in opposition to Britain's. Corn, as Loudon pointed out, became a political instrument for self-definition and resistance, and laid the foundation for a republican cuisine. A cookbook written by the ladies of Toronto in 1878 complained that Canadians had no national dish to distinguish themselves from the British. In Europe, after the defeat of the double monarchy in 1866, Hungarians nationalized goulash, a southern specialty until then ignored and considered vulgar. Shortly after independence, Romania also published its first book of recipes in the national language a few years after 1878. Foreign names defining culinary specialties were avoided, especially on public events. Thus, linguistic borders overlap with the national gastronomic ones. In Spain, as well as in Germany, state banquet menus had to be written in national languages. In almost every country, popular plates were named after kings, princes, and princesses, the beloved icons of the nation. You have here the Königin Luise from Prussia. In Italy, we find the pizza margherita, in the United Kingdom, Prince Albert pudding, and Victoria sandwiches. In Majorca, the recipe of the sobrasada was attributed to King Martin I of Aragon. In the 19th century, famous dishes were named after heroes or emperors. Here you see the Kaiserschmarrn, an Austrian dish. In fact, the Age of Nations was also the age of empires. In Russia, Tsar Nicholas I aimed at state-oriented patriotism, focusing on Russianness, and did not welcome foreign behavior or cultures. The topic of cuisine fell into the field of tension between Slavophiles and Westernizers. A popular weekly column in the Econom praised Russian dishes. They were simple, healthy, without any spices, without artifice, moral, and opposed to foreign food and spices. Cuisine became one of the pillars of the new heritage community. At the center of this community, there were women. They actively contributed, allowing national borders into the kitchen and the everyday life. In the United States, the close link between family and nation, reinforced by the founding myth of American motherhood, was reaffirmed in the kitchen. In the United States, Catherine Beecher's The American Women's Home criticized British cuisine. While not despising the French, it did not fail to mention the good patriots, that is, the good culinary habits of the grandmothers. And in 1846, you see Sarah Josepha Hale, on the left hand of the slide, launched a campaign to celebrate Thanksgiving as the national holiday, commemorating unification, expansion, and inclusion around the dinner table and the turkey. Books of domestic economy, written for women by women, transmitted the civilizing and domesticating role of middle-class women. They also marked a clear-cut border between the white settlers and the natives, or the black slaves. Thus, the color line clearly appeared. In Europe, Magdalena Dobrumila-Ratigova provided Czech cuisine with a Bible, and Katarina Prato was the author of a cookbook running to more than 700 pages. In Denmark, recipe books written by women focused on nation building in the throes of heavy territorial losses, and they promoted the consumption of Danish products. Russian and Lithuanian housewives made similar statements. In Serbia, Slovenia, and Croatia, women also wrote national cookbooks, carefully differentiating them from those drawing on foreign sources. Food supported the representation of the nation as a family, sometimes even in the ethnic sense. This shift appeared clearly in the interwar years, not only in totalitarian regimes. In 1934, the Hotels and Restaurants Associations of Great Britain published a book where we can read the following sentence. The French people are, by nature as well as by training, for the most part instinctively cooks, in the true sense of the word. The British, as a race, are not, though there are many individual exceptions. But don't forget, different nationalities have different tastes and employ different methods. And in France, the capital of gastronomy, Action Française had already devoted attention to French cooking. However, it was in the interwar years that such statements took a clear step further. Here we detect a shift in the definition of borders now connected to women's ancestral memory, atavisme, souche, and race. In his novel La vie et la passion de Dodin Bouffin-Gourmet, 1924, the historian and writer Marcel Rouff declared, "Gastronomy is innate to the race. The model is the peasant woman, the souche, who never learned cooking at school or in books because she knew it from birth, atavistically." In the 1930s, while praising the excellence of French cuisine, the middle-class women's magazine Elle cautiously presented a few exotic dishes, but it introduced them explicitly as alien. Rural, authentic, ethnic cuisine glorified the nation through its peasants in France, as in Belarus, or again in Lithuania. When describing the oldest recipe for Lithuanian zeppelins, potatoes stuffed with chopped meat, or through Belarusian epic poems, the culinary roots were to be found in peasants' life. Nazi totalitarianism made use of the practice of cooking together and eating together. German food is important even in Leni Riefenstahl's movies. Gastronationalism became intense under Franco. Only from the late 1960s on did regional or international gastronomic traditions start to re-emerge in Spain. Food nationalism seemed to grow stronger as a result of the European Union's recent difficulties. As an extreme example, one could quote the words of UK Environment Secretary Michael Gove, who in late 2017 stigmatized an unpatriotic attitude towards cheese in the face of concerns about tariffs on cheese imported to the UK after Brexit, as if British citizens should consume British cheese and eschew foreign cheese as a matter of patriotism. It is therefore important to reflect once more on the concepts of authenticity and of food heritage in their connections with nationalism, and to suggest a more flexible idea of heritage, which can reflect the food differences and the nuances within Europe. And now we jump to the second part of the lecture on populism. Food is a powerful discursive tool because it belongs to everybody's everyday life and experience. Thus, it can easily break through and talk and attract the man and the woman on the street. Imbued with ambiguous nostalgia, it can remind us of the protective intimacy of the private homes and the national home, of the nation's individual body and the body of the nation. But it can also effectively voice othering and disgust for others. Thus, the emotional connection between food and the feeling of national belonging can also be used by politicians in various countries to mobilize and manipulate the masses, starting from apparently innocent issues such as the preservation of tradition embedded in nostalgia and in an often idealized image of the rural national landscape. It may contribute to successful and extremely dangerous populist propaganda, and in fact, it does so. When balance begins to be lost, writes anthropologist La Cecla, cuisine is the first thing to go. Instead of fostering coexistence and tolerance, it turns into the first dividing issue. In Thessaloniki, Jewish, Orthodox, and Muslim communities lived next to each other. Their food was extremely similar, though they call it by different names. It was in fact almost identical but for the use of a single spice. When the conditions for peaceful cohabitation disappeared, however, the food of the others suddenly became barbarian and inferior. The same happened in Constantinople, Istanbul at the time of the Greek-Turkish hostilities. Turks stopped buying spices from the Rum shops, and their owners, who were previously friendly neighbors, suddenly became enemies. An excellent example is the 2004 movie by Tassos Boulmetis, Politiki Cucina, in English, A Touch of Spice. Such a sudden change is prone to happen when a war starts. For sure, it has happened many times in the Balkans. Once more, La Cecla reminds us that in Croatia in the 90s, during the wars, all of a sudden, those eating Serbian food started to be regarded as traitors. In Poland, as well as in Hungary and France, right-wing populism are emerging as complex and dangerous phenomena, often rooted in the countryside. They can use arguments connected to the rural imagination of an uncontaminated national landscape to appeal the public. They can exploit rural resentments and use food issues first against migrants and then against political elites and the EU. Therefore, it might not come as a surprise if the Hamas political scientists and editorials of the New York Times, Javier Corrales, use the gastronomic metaphor to define populism. Food can mirror mixophobia, the fear not just of foreignness and otherness, but of mestization. Anthropologists know well that people who eat strikingly different foods or similar foods in different ways might be thought to be strikingly different, sometimes even less human, as Sidney Mintz pointed out. The subject is important for the way populist movements have used the food issue. To ridicule others for their food is no new strategy. It is found in the age of early nationalism and colonialism. In recent years, some European populist movements have made great play with it against migrants and Muslims. This broadly transversal phenomenon deserves attention for all its implications, such as the potential leverage over a medium-low culture public and its marked communicative relevance. Significantly, both Lega Nord, who started the trend, and Alternative für Deutschland, AfD, have used food for some of their most successful electoral posters. Xenophobia and mixophobia are likely to rub shoulders with localism and ruralism. Both cuisine and agriculture can provide good material for opposing both immigration and European policies, which French peasants perceive as hostile, an argument which has recently been picked up once more by the Lega in Italy. the mixophobic discourse built on reactions against Americanization as well. You can see here Isla Burgers shops in several places in Europe. Now, the criticism of the Isla Burgers combined opposition to Islamization as well as to Americanization. Raoul Bouvet and the Confédération Paysanne gave early voice to regional food, thus linking deep criticism of globalization with authentic French culture. They drew on the idea of the symbiotic relationship between people and landscape. Their localism is certainly not reflexive nor sophisticated. In Nice, the Identitaires organized a gastronomic combat, while in Lyon they proposed a marche des cochons, a pig's march, banned by the local authorities. They also organized pork-based soups identitaires, broadly attended aperitifs called apéro saucisson épinard, where sausages and French wines were served. One expression is recurrent in their rhetoric: souche. This is a term that we have heard before. This is a term dear to the right wing of Action Française already in the early 20th century. Yes to polenta, no to couscous was one of the Lega's top slogans in the 90s. More recently, Alternative für Deutschland used a picture of young women in classic Bavarian costume, the Dirndl, to convey the message: Germany, take my word for it. Burka, I prefer Burgundy wine. France followed with a slogan combined nostalgia for the terroir and Islamophobia in the slogan devised by Nisa Rebella in Nice: no to kebab, yes to soca. Incidentally, though, soca is not a French food. This thin, unleavened chickpea pancake is no different from the cecina eaten in Pisa or the farinata that probably originated from Genoa. But it is also present in many seaports in Italy, such as Livorno, where it is called again cecina, or in Palermo, where it is called panelle. Thus, soca is not an identity mark for Provence, but quite possibly a typical food of the Mediterranean, widely present in the Maghreb, and having strong similarities with Indian specialties. In some European countries, here you have the different ways that soca or panelle can be presented in several areas in the Mediterranean. In some European countries, populist movements use food to other and reject others. Paradoxically enough, in the United Kingdom, curry and chicken tikka masala, invented in England, came close to being national dishes. By 1997, a Gallup poll announced that curry was the nation's favorite food, and in 2001, British Foreign Minister Robin Cook declared that chicken tikka masala was Britain's national dish. Food critics, however, were more skeptical. They immediately called this dish a British invention, not a sign of multiculturalism, but a demonstration of the British ability to transform foreign foods into their own, as journalists wrote also in the New York Times. We are coming now to the last chapter of our story, which takes us back to Italy and to Bologna, where a Tortellini affair or a Tortellini war broke out in October 2019. The occasion was the feast of San Petronius, the patron saint of the city, traditionally celebrated with a collective table. Dozens of volunteers prepared tortellini and served them for all those who wanted to enjoy it. They prepared 500 kilos of tortellini. Alongside the tortellini filled with pork, they also prepared about 5 kilos tortellini with a chicken filling for the ones who do not eat pork, mainly because of their religious affiliation. Romano Prodi, see him on the left of the slide, commented on the first page of one of the most important Italian newspapers. The news of this almost negligible event was quickly spread in a distorted way. Fake news was spread that all 500 kilos tortellini had been stuffed with chicken to please Islamic immigrants. It was a tempting opportunity for right-wing populists who promptly entered the Tortellini war. Salvini and many others quickly reacted, attributing to the organizers the double sacrilege of having profaned our religious traditions to please the Muslims and our culinary tradition for having expelled pork from tortellini. The debates that followed would be worthy of a much more colorful pictures. Bolognese cooks and chefs took advantage of the publicity of the incident to underline that tortellini are of very different nature. Other cooks claimed that the sacred name could only refer to the equally sacred recipe received from the ancestors and consecrated by the appropriate committee. In fact, the first Bolognese tortellini are now only described at the end of the 18th century by Francesco Leonardi in his monumental work De Modena Piscius. He was a staff chef of the time. He worked as a personal chef of Catherine II of Russia. And in fact, his author describes the recipe and leaves no room for interpretation. The ingredients of the tortellini are roasted chicken breast, well-cleaned beef marrow, parmesan grated, butter, salt, nutmeg, cinnamon, and 2 raw egg yolks. With this filling, tortellini alla bolognese have nothing to do with pork. It was Pellegrino Artusi who spread the pork filling recipe. Last December, Salvini attacked again the Nutri-Score, which warns from eating food which contains too much fat. His point was to criticize Brussels. From Brussels, he said they want to force us to eat this or that. Once more, food provided an argument to raise boundaries and delegitimize Europe. In a short paper written in 1986, when he was a fellow at the Palo Alto Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences, and meanwhile acting as a reviewer of the restaurant scene in the San Francisco area, Aruna Padurai discussed the authority of gastronomic standards. A well-known post-colonial intellectual as well as an author of major early contributions such as gastropolitics in Hindu South Asia, he asked questions about immanent norms and authorities. Among other agencies, he quoted restaurants and professional cooks. I quote, "Authenticity as a criterion seems always to emerge just after its subject matter has been significantly transformed. How is one to generate stable criteria of authenticity for traditions that are always changing? All cuisines have a history. Tastes shift, regional distinctions go in and out of focus, new techniques and technologies appear. New foods come in and go out of vogue in all complex culinary traditions. The idea of authenticity seems to imply a timeless perspective on profoundly historical processes. Thus, the transhistorical ring of authority with which the word authenticity is sometimes used in the evaluation of foreign cuisines is spurious. As you can see, some chefs have also pointed out the same problems. Istanbul chef Musa Dagdeviren, for instance, in a Netflix program, pointed out when you define food in ethnic terms, it sets communities against each other. This is good food for thought when dealing with borders. Thank you.